This is a reading of Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, written by Richard Rorty. Introduction. Philosophers usually think of their discipline as one which discusses perennial, eternal problems. Problems which arise as soon as one reflects. Some of these concern the difference between human beings and other beings, and are crystallized in questions concerning the relation between the mind and the body. Other problems concern the legitimation of claims to know, and are crystallized in questions concerning the foundation of knowledge. To discover these foundations is to discover something about the mind, and conversely. Philosophy as a discipline thus sees itself as the attempt to underwrite or debunk claims to knowledge made by science, morality, art, or religion. It purports to do this on the basis of its special understanding of the nature of knowledge and of mind. Philosophy can be foundational in respect to the rest of culture because culture is the assemblage of claims to knowledge, and philosophy adjudicates such claims. It can do so because it understands the foundations of knowledge, and it finds these foundations in a study of man as knower, of the mental processes or the activity of representation which make knowledge possible. To know is to represent accurately what is outside the mind, and so to understand the possibility and nature of knowledge is to understand the way in which the mind is able to construct such representations. Philosophy's central concern is to be a general theory of representation, a theory which will divide culture up into the areas which represent reality well, those which represent it less well, and those which do not represent it at all, despite their pretense of doing so. We owe the notion of a theory of knowledge based on an understanding of mental processes to the 17th century, and especially to Locke. We owe the notion of the mind as a separate entity in which processes occur to the same period, and especially to Descartes. We owe the notion of philosophy as a tribunal of pure reason, upholding or denying the claims of the rest of culture to the 18th century, and especially to Kant. But this Kantian notion presupposed general assent to Lockean notions of mental processes and Cartesian notions of mental substance. In the 19th century, the notions of philosophy as a foundational discipline, which grounds knowledge claims, was consolidated in the writings of the Neo-Kantians. Occasional protests against this conception of culture as in need of grounding and against the pretensions of a theory of knowledge to perform this task in, for example, Nietzsche and William James, went largely unheard. Philosophy became, for the intellectuals, a substitute for religion. It was the area of culture where one touched bottom, where one found the vocabulary and the convictions which permitted one to explain and justify one's activity as an intellectual, and thus to discover the significance of one's life. At the beginning of our century, this claim was reaffirmed by philosophers, notably Russell and Husserl, who were concerned to keep philosophy rigorous and scientific. But there was a note of desperation in their voices, for by this time the triumph of the secular over the claims of religion was almost complete. Thus, the philosopher could no longer see himself as in the actual intellectual avant-garde or as protecting men against the forces of superstition. Further, in the course of the 19th century, a new form of culture had arisen, a culture of the man of letters, the intellectual who wrote poems and novels and political treatises, and criticisms of other people's poems and novels and treatises. Descartes, Locke, and Kant had written in a period in which the secularization of culture was being made possible by the success of natural science. But by the early 20th century, the scientists had become as remote from most intellectuals as had the theologians. Poets and novelists had taken the place of both preachers and philosophers as the moral teachers of the youth. The result was that the more scientific and rigorous philosophy became, the less it had to do with the rest of culture, and the more absurd its traditional pretensions seemed. The attempts of both analytic philosophers and phenomenologists to ground this and criticize that were shrugged off by those whose activities were purportedly being grounded or criticized. Philosophy as a whole was shrugged off by those who wanted an ideology or a self-image. It is against this background that we should seek the work of three most important philosophers, of the three most important philosophers of our century: Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and Dewey. Each tried in his early years to find a new way of making philosophy foundational, a new way of formulating an ultimate context for thought. Wittgenstein tried to construct a new theory of representation, which would have nothing to do with mentalism. Heidegger to construct a new set of philosophical categories, which would have nothing to do with science, epistemology, or the Cartesian quest for certainty. And Dewey to construct a naturalized version of Hegel's vision of history. Each of the three came to see his earlier effort as self-deceptive, as an attempt to retain a certain conception of philosophy after the notions needed to flesh out that conception, the 17th century notions of knowledge and mind, had been discarded. Each of the three in his later work broke free of the Kantian conception of philosophy as foundational and spent his time warning us against those very temptations to which he himself had once succumbed. Thus, their later work is therapeutic rather than constructive, edifying rather than systematic, designed to make the reader question his own motives for philosophizing rather than to supply him with a new philosophical program.